Hi everyone, welcome to Module 13, Presentation Aids. Today we're going to be going over the way that you need to use aids during your presentation and the proper way to do it, because what we've been taught in the past on how to do like a PowerPoint presentation is actually fairly incorrect. We want to minimize the amount of words that we have in our PowerPoints and maximize the visual aids portion of it by increasing the amount of images, scales, charts, maps, whatever it is that you're trying to represent throughout your speech, rather than having the audience read your PowerPoints. So kind of starting off with using presentation software, make sure you're focusing on your speech. The PowerPoint display is an aid, not a replacement for your presentation. So make sure that you have very little to no words in your presentation. You should only have aids that are allowing you to, or showing the audience what you are saying, rather than having the audience members read off of your slides. You should have really only visual aids, only pictures, only maps, scales, whatever it is in your PowerPoint presentation, rather than words. But it should be about your speech still. It should be going towards the content of your speech. And you need to develop a plan. Begin with your outline, your speaking outline. So find parts of your outline where you have evidence showing some statistical data, or you have a good point in which you can show a picture of what you're talking about. Find in your outline those visual creative words that you've used in order to represent it with an aid, so you can have everybody be on the same picture when you're creatively describing a scene in which you can show in a slide. Consider whether talking points require visual aids. So there are some talking points that will need it. If you're giving a lot of data over statistics, that is hard to just say, or even maps. Explaining a map out loud is really hard if you don't have a map showing people in front of you. So those are points that would require some type of visual aid, as opposed to, if you're talking about dogs, you probably don't need a picture of the dog, and you're not going to be flipping through your slides like crazy fast, but you should have something that overall represents the point in which you will be discussing. Decide how many slides you'll need as well. I think having minimum one slide per minute. If you do more than one slide per minute, it may be hard to follow and hard to track within your speech to remember when to click without looking at your visual aid. So remember, you should space it out where you have equal portions of time for each slide, just like you will with your main points and subpoints. You need to have equal portion of time for them, but you'll need to do that as well with your visual aid. And determine how to arrange slides effectively. I always say that when you click on your slide, you should open it up right as you begin the discussion of what it is. And then you should keep it up so people can look at it while you're describing it, while you're describing features around it. Never open up the slide or the picture after you've discussed what you're talking about, because then people look at the visual aid and they just stop paying attention to the next portion of your speech, but look back to see and think about the last portion. You should always pull it up as you begin to discuss whatever you are about that visual aid. And you don't necessarily have to refer to the visual aid. I would not say, look to this PowerPoint slide for this point and this point. I would just continue your speech and keep describing parts of your speech, as that visual aid is just a reflection of what you are saying. Avoid copyright infringement. Make sure that you're abiding by copyright restrictions. If you're using something that has been published, make sure you cite what you are using and recognize fair use of provisions. Always cite the source material and consult the school's information technology office if you have any questions about whether or not you have access to certain material, in order to avoid serious consequences for improper acquisition. Again, another thing in this class, if you are if you are using a PowerPoint slide and you are not citing the material that you're using that has been published, for example, if you're using a data set and someone has published that in an article, you need to cite that article. You can't just use that data set as your own information. So make sure that you are orally citing, but also citing it in your PowerPoint, if that's the data that you're using. In order to design presentations, you need to keep the design super simple. Avoid flooding your slides with text. Like I said, you should have little to no text. I prefer zero text on your slides from the beginning to the end. Zero text. I mean, you can have your title slide where you're saying, the title of your presentation by yourself for maybe the introduction, but then you immediately need to slip into the next slide and begin your PowerPoint. When you have slide or text on your slides, you limit yourself to people reading off of your PowerPoints rather than people listening to what you're saying. So make sure that you're following the 6x6 rule. 6 words per line, 6 lines per slide. I still think this is too much, but this is when you're giving a PowerPoint presentation in person. When you're doing it online, kind of like this voiceover recording I'm doing right now, I'm wanting you to read what's going on here as I explain through it. And when I'm doing this right here, this means that I'm going to be limiting the amount of words. That way I can use it more for explanation and keep myself on track, but not overwhelming you with the amount of notes that you need to be reading while we're going through it. Use design elements. Follow consistent design decisions for your presentation aids. Make sure that you are not overwhelming your audience with your design. You can have a different design for you have the same theme, but a different design for each page. Now that you can do the smart design on PowerPoint where you can change it up a little bit per slide, but make sure it's not distracting. Make sure you don't have too much going on. Having consistency within your slides helps prevent this distractions of people looking at your design rather than listening to what you're saying. And using a consistent design elements in each aid is really critical in order to keep people on track with the purpose of what you're talking about as well. Make sure you're selecting appropriate fonts. Those cursive, wild fonts, they're hard to read. And make sure that it's not bold to the point where it's all smushed together too. You should be using APA style of font, whether it's Times New Roman or Calibri. All of these fonts are extremely good for a professional presentation in any way. When you're using too much style of your lettering, it gets to the point where it's hard enough to read to where they're not paying attention to what you're saying. Again, you should not be using too much boldface, underlining, italics, but use it for emphasis when you need to. And use color carefully. You should be using black for your text and white for your background, or a lighter color on black. Don't go out and change a bunch of colors, make all your text blue or all your text green. Remember to be professional. And it sets a mood of the presentation. Do you want people to be paying attention to you, or do you want people to be your friend? Or do you want people to think that things that you do are pretty, or things that you do are important? And so I think you need to think about that when you're choosing color, choosing font, making things easy to see. And you don't want to make things unreadable or hard to pay attention to. So when you're speaking with your presentations, make sure that there are some benefits, but there's also some negativities. It'll help listeners process and retain information. We're all part visual learners, part audio, and part kinesthetic. When you're listening to a presentation, the kinesthetic is not necessarily there, but you do have visual and audio. So it allows us to retain information more when we do a little bit of a crossover. So that's definitely a benefit. But Also, it allows us to convey information in a time-saving fashion. You don't have to explain or be as creative with the explanation if it's right there in front of you. It also enhances an image of professionalism because it goes to show you know what you're talking about, and can spark interest, can make a speech. But you have to make sure that your aid is appropriate for your presentation. Using objects, models, pictures, graphs, charts, audio, video, and multimedia. Make sure not to overwhelm. If you're speaking and giving a presentation, you should have very little to no audio or video, or even multimedia within your presentations. Now, if it's a long presentation, over an hour or so, you can break it up into video and multimedia. But I recommend the shorter your speech is, you should not be doing these things. In this class, I do not do audio or video. You should have objects and models, pictures, graphs, and charts, because remember, you're only giving a 4 to 5 minute speech. So we don't have time to do this, and you have to stay organized within your speech. But these things are good if you need to break up a long lecture with someone else talking and pulling the audience or drawing the audience back in. In class, we do a lot of, video examples too of like instances in which things happen in speeches. I show Michael Scott from The Office in a lot of my in-class presentations because he's a good example of bad speeches. So these types of things are really good for longer lectures rather than a short presentation. But in your short presentations, it should mainly consist of objects, models, pictures, graphs, and charts. Make sure they're professional if you are doing a picture. Make sure that if you blow it up, it's not blurry. Make sure your graphs and charts are correct as per the evidence and information that you've found and consistent across the board. And make sure that you're definitely citing these things at the end of your presentation. In order to correctly do so, look it up on Purdue OWL, and it'll give you an example of what a reference page should look like at the very end. Let me know if you have any questions too over your visual aids, because I want to make sure that your visual aids are correct for your persuasive speech so you can maximize your points on those.